Today, we are very happy to have with us Ken Robison. If you're a regular here, Ken is no stranger to you. He's spoken a number of times. He's written a number of books. He is a chronicler of Western history, of the neglected aspects of Western history. He lives in Great Falls, but works at the Overholser Research Center in Fort Benton. He also serves on the Sun River Valley Historical Society, the Great Falls Cascade County Historic Preservation Commission, the Big Sky Country National Heritage Area, and he's a relatively new member of the Montana Historical Society Board of Trustees, but he's certainly not new to the society. In 2010, he was awarded our Trustees Award, which is the highest honor given in Montana history. So this is Ken's 9th book. It will be available in the bookstore, and Ken would be happy to sign it for you. And Rod, our store manager, would be more than happy to sell you 10 or 20 copies if you want that many. Anyway, this book was published last year in 2020 by the History Press. And without more ado, Ken Robison.
Kirby, do we need to cut that off since I'm using this?
It actually doesn't interfere.
It doesn't? Okay, good. Don't need that. Hey, it's great to be here with you this afternoon. And it's always great to be in the Historical Society. Usually I'm upstairs researching, but it's more fun to be down here with you. Last year, 150 years ago, the birth of the fort, the trail in the country that bear that colorful name, WhoopUp. It all began in 1869 when the stage was set by the withdrawal of the Hudson Bay Company from their monopoly on Western Canada. For the next 13 years, from 1870 to 1883, until the arrival of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, trade goods, supplies, immigrants, adventurers, everything came up the mighty Missouri River by steamboat and then was loaded on wagons and hauled up the trail that became known as the WhoopUp Trail. And that trail assumed legendary notoriety and fame along the way. But the trail was only the beginning. It led directly to the settlement of the prairie provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, with Montana businessmen like I.G. Baker and Tom and John Power, and cattle ranchers from Montana like Charlie Conrad and Howell Harris, helping begin the great Canadian cattle industry. Even a young woman, Anna Armstrong, took a modest-sized dairy herd with her and crossed the Medicine Line up to Fort Macleod, where the Northwest Mounted Police were headquartered, and opened Alberta's first dairy. So simply put, WhoopUp and its aftermath led directly to today's great shared history between Montana and the Canadian prairie provinces. So here are the two great trails we will be talking about. The first one is if I get the right button, nope, that wasn't it. The Ripplinger Trail came up essentially from Sun River Crossing, kind of the center of Sun River Valley, up through today's Blackfoot Reservation and on into Canada. The other trail, and the main one we'll be talking about, is WhoopUp from Fort Benton, and I'll describe the way up with it. From Fort Benton, the WhoopUp Trail followed the original Mullen Road for a few miles before heading northwest across the Teton River at Captain Nell's Crossing, and on to the northwest past the Knees, across the Marias River, past today's Shelby, and on to the west of Three Buttes, today's Sweetgrass Hills, across the unmarked international boundary, better known then as the Medicine Line, and on to the Belly River near today's Lethbridge. WhoopUp Country formed along that trail that passed through the broad rolling prairie lands between Fort Benton northward into the newly formed Canadian Northwest Territory. That was before the creation of the provinces we know today. The WhoopUp Trail became the first international highway in the Northwest, and Fort Benton became the birthplace of WhoopUp Country. Johnny Healy was on a mission of revenge as he left his Sun River trading post and crossed the Medicine Line in early January of 1870. Revenge because he and other Fort Benton friends had been badly treated by the Hudson Bay Company some years before. Healy and his partner Al Hamilton were the first Fort Benton free traders to lead an expedition into the Northwest Territory. This bold undertaking broke the fur and robe trading monopoly of the mighty Hudson Bay Company, which for 2 centuries had been absolutely dominant in what was called Rupert's Land, from Great Slave Lake to the present Montana northern boundary line, and even across into modern Montana with posts like Fort Kana in western Montana. Thus began the WhoopUp Era, a new period in the transnational history of northern Montana and the prairie provinces of Canada, an era that would open up new settlements, and only with the arrival of that railroad in 1883 would it end. And then it was just the beginning, really, in the shared heritage that lives on to today. Adventurer Healy, his partner Al Hamilton, and 11 wagons departed Healy's Sun River trading post at Sun River Crossing in secrecy with mild weather from Chinook winds just after Christmas on December 28th of 1869 on their epic journey northward. You may have, if you've driven that crossing of Sun River, you may recognize this little white house on the north bank of the river. This was the site of Johnny Healy's trading post, and this house has logs from Healy's post embedded in its walls today. I might add that it was here at Healy's trading post, General Thomas Francis Marr had spent a week recovering his health enough to continue on to Fort Benton in late June of 1867 before he arrived in Fort Benton looking for arms shipments and wound up being lost to posterity in the June rise of the Missouri River. The expedition had 14 men, including Healy, his partner, plus black Teamster Bob Mills, Mexican Spanish Joe Arana, and 2 biracial Blackfeet, Jerry Potts, who later became a hero as a scout for the Northwest Mounted Police, and George Starr. Those 2 were hunters. Along with them, during the final part of the journey, were members of the Kainai blood Blackfoot, adding not only protection, but also confirmation that Healy's trading expedition enjoyed approval of the Kainai, whose historic territory was their destination. Following the Ripplinger Trail that I showed you earlier, the party moved slowly, trading along the way, traveling the 160 miles over a 3-week period before arriving on the 17th of January, 1870, at the mouth of the confluence of the St. Mary's River, where it joined the Belly River, just south of today's Lethbridge. These were dangerous times, for just a week later, the Marias Massacre occurred, with the U.S. Army under Major Eugene Baker striking Piegan Blackfeet heavy runners' winter encampment. Healy's expedition immediately began to cut down trees to begin constructing a trading post. Their first post provided both trading and living quarters for the men, it was christened Fort Hamilton, and winter trade began with the Kainai Blackfoot resident in the area. While most of the men were engaged in building the first crude fort, this is the later fort that was built the next winter, several Kainai searched with Healy and Hamilton for the highly influential chief many spotted horses at his winter camp near the Belly River. After giving gifts to the chief, Healy received a, quote, winter wife thought to be a daughter of the chief. Critically, Healy also received permission to build the trading post among the Kainai. The shocking tragedy at the Pecuni South Pagan Heavy Runners winter camp on the Marias, I'd emphasize again, had just happened 1 week earlier before they arrived on the Belly River. Recall also that Healy's expedition had met a party of 20 Kainai who were very short of food, and Healy's party gave them food, and that was the Kainai group that joined them on the trip northward. And that band was under the hereditary Kainai chief Buffalo Bull's Backfat, and he had a powerful standing within the tribe. These Kainai appreciated the food they'd received and the friendship of Healy and Hamilton, and had urged him to go ahead and build the post. Before the stockade was finished, hundreds of Pecuni South Pagan, remember this is the tribe that had been hit by Baker, under the leadership of Cut Hand, approached. They were bent on revenge for the recent massacre and planned to kill the Euro-American traders after trading with them. A warning came to Healy from the Kainai, quote, "Cut Hand is here. He will trade only for powder and ball. When he gets enough, he will kill you white men," unquote. Healy's men retreated to the partially constructed fort and prepared for the worst. Kainai chief Buffalo Bull's Backfat arrived on scene and declared, "Friends, you know the white soldiers a short time ago cleaned out the Pagan camp over on the Marias. There were no warriors in the camp, for it was a sick camp, and the able-bodied men were out hunting for meat for their wives, babies, and old people. The white soldiers came in the night and slaughtered the sick old men and women, the mothers and the babies as they slept, or hunted them down in the snow and killed them. The hearts of all Blackfeet, the Pagans and the Bloods, are filled with bitterness against the whites for this. Cut Hand and his Pagans have come to kill you. But you men have been kind to us, and you are our traders. We Bloods were hungry when you met us and fed us. We're grateful. Now 500 of my warriors have joined our party. The Pagans will have to kill us before they kill you. They outnumber us greatly, but they are our cousins, and I do not believe they will force us to fight. If they do, we will die fighting with you, white men. Open the door and look out." With that action, the Kainai took defensive positions around the stockade. Hamilton opened the door of the trading post and saw the fort completely surrounded by these Kainai warriors ready for the fight. Chief Bull's Backfat stepped out and addressed the Pagans that were just arriving, signing for them to start the trade. They lined up, every man carrying weapons of some sort, and each one accompanied by a woman or two laden with furs and buffalo robes. The Kainai chief admitted only 2 at a time to the fort to trade, but little time was lost. Instead of the usual barter of furs and robes for cloth, blankets, tobacco, beads, calico, and other trade articles used by the natives, the Pagan all threw down their robes and demanded powder and ball. The white men gave them at first 40 rounds of powder and ball for 1 robe, but as the supply of ammunition dwindled, they cut it to 20 and finally to 10 rounds. They expected a protest, but there was none. The last trade was made by Cut Hand, the Pagan chief, and as he finished, the white men saw that the crisis was at hand. It was, for as the Pagan chief started out of the door, Buffalo Bull's Backfat stopped him and said, "You have finished trading with these white men. Now go and go peacefully. You have come to kill these white men. You will have to kill me and my men first. If I find that out later that you molest these friends of mine, I will attack your camp and you'll be the first I kill." Cuthand stalked out of the fort and briefly ordered his band to break camp and started north. It took 2.5 hours for the large group to pass by. After they'd gone, the white traders started cooking a feast for the Bloods, and they made merry. They had taken 1,600 bison robes and many furs and elk hides in the trade. Buffalo Bull Backfat had kept the peace, and the traders and Fort Hamilton were saved. Fort Hamilton was a crude, just a beginning, but it was underway, and that first trading winter proved a huge financial success. Fort Hamilton, at the end of the trading season, was burned after that first winter, and this photo shows the more elaborate successor that was built in the late summer and fall of that same year, 1870, leading into 71. And it was built by William Gladstone, a carpenter from Canada that had worked with the Hudson Bay Company. He and his crew of Métis built this elaborate fort, and of course William Gladstone's a direct ancestor of today's Blackfoot balladeer Jack Gladstone. And the name soon changed to Fort WhoopUp. There are many stories about where the name came from, but one of my favorites involves a colorful, larger-than-life character, this trader Charles Choquette, who freighted from Fort Benton to Fort Hamilton. Choquette didn't know much English, and whenever he learned a word, he had a habit of repeating it over and over. There was an 80-mile barren stretch between Fort Benton and Fort Hamilton, and it was a dread to the outfits that made the trip. One night, Choquette was drawing near to the fort. His outfit was tired and lagging, and the men were complaining, including Charlie himself. Finally, one bullwalker said, "Let's hoop up and get to the fort." This struck Charlie as a good phrase, and he kept repeating it over and over. As the train neared the fort, he yelled out, "Hoop up!" And from then on, it became known as Fort WhoopUp. Probably every bullwhacker and every trader had their own story, but this one's Charlie Choquette's. Through the bold action of Healy and Hamilton, Fort Benton Free Traders had pried open the door to the former Rupert's land, and into this vacuum poured hundreds of Montana traders and freighters, opening more than 40 trading posts north of the Medicine Line, posts bearing striking names like WhoopUp, Slideout, and Standoff. This is a list compiled by Canadian archaeologists Kennedy and Reeves in their remarkable inventory of whiskey forts, with input from many sources, including Joel Overholtzer, the longtime editor of the Fort Benton River Press. The story of Fort Standoff involves a battle of wits and will between trader Joe Kipp and Deputy U.S. Marshal Charles Hard, who tried hard to stop the whiskey trade, both within the U.S. and also now that was headed for Canadian territory. Kipp was determined to move whiskey in secrecy from Helena. He couldn't take it out of Fort Benton because it was too closely watched there, but out of Helena he thought he could get away with it. So to do this, he slipped out of Helena with his load of whiskey and loaded it on a sturdy raft on the Missouri River and took it down the Missouri River to the mouth of the Sun River by today's Great Falls, where it was loaded on a freight train. Kipp and his men started the long trip north. Marshal Hard eventually picked up the trail and rode hard to overtake Kipp. Several days later, just after crossing the North Fork of the Milk River, Kip looked back and saw a lone horseman coming up fast on their trail. "It's the marshal," said Kip, "and right now and here is where we'll stand him off." Hard rode past the first and second wagons without stopping, pulling up at the third, which Kip was driving at the time. "Well, Joe," he said with a grin, "I've got you at last. Just turn around and head your wagons for Fort Benton." "Hard, you're 20 minutes late," Kip replied. "You should have overtaken us before we crossed the North Fork of the Milk River." "Come on," the marshal insisted. "No fooling. This is a serious business, so turn your teams around." "You have no authority here," said Kip, "for on this spot we're in Canada. The North Fork of the Milk River, a mile back is the line." Hard was so taken aback that he didn't speak for a minute. The international boundary had not been surveyed at that point, so there were no markings. No one knew exactly where those markings would be when it eventually, a few years later, would be marked. But it was generally believed the chief mountain in the North Fork of the Milk River were on or very close, one way or the other, to the 49th degree parallel, which constituted the boundary line. Hard finally said, "You have no proof that you are in Canada. I'll take a chance on being south of the line. I arrest you all for having liquor in your possession in Indian country." Kip laughed. "You have no proof that we're not north of the line. We take the chance that we're in Canada and there are 5 of us and only 1 of you. Right here, we stand you off." Hard argued and threatened, but his words were wasted, and he no doubt realized the weakness of his position. He suddenly wheeled his horse and rode back down the trail. Later, when the line was actually surveyed, the spot where he had tried to make the arrest was found to be 300 yards south of the border. No images have survived of Kip's first fort, which was Fort Standoff. But this is Joe Kip's later Fort Kip. While most traders and bullwhackers moving into WhoopUp Country were Euro-Americans, they were joined by many Métis, many mixed race, both Blackfeet and Assiniboine and other mixed, and included also several Mexican and African Americans, black men including Philip Barnes, James Van Litberg, Henry Mills, and William Bond had long worked for the American Fur Company on the Upper Missouri. Bond actually became the first free trader arrested and jailed after the arrival of the Northwest Mounted Police. Henry Mills, a hunter and trapper, and actually a blood tribal member and renowned bullwhacker, was called Six-a-Wekwan, or Black White Man, by the Blackfoot. Colin Thomas, in his excellent study of Black pioneers of Canada, wrote, "In 2 languages, the illiterate Mills cajoled, coaxed, and cussed the plodding oxen as few could." Certainly unique among the WhoopUp Black residents was Molly Smith, aka McLean. Freed from slavery on a Missouri plantation, Molly came up the Missouri River by steamboat to Fort Benton about 1868. By the mid-1870s, Molly had moved on to the new town of Fort Walsh, where she joined the small black community and operated a laundry while possibly dabbling in bootlegging by smuggling her whiskey in a special leather compartment built into her brassiere. And this is from Canadian historian sources of mine. The times were often as brutally harsh as the Montana-Canadian weather, yet both Montanans and Canadians have tended to exaggerate for dramatic effect the traders, the whiskey posts, the whooping it up environment. After all, neither the reconstructed Fort WhoopUp near today's Lethbridge nor reconstructed old Fort Benton trading post at Fort Benton would be quite as exciting to tourists and have quite their luster without the whoop-up stories, sometimes portrayed accurately, other times to the extreme, especially by Canadian historians. Similarly, most writing of the era has come from Canadians, and they emphasize the extreme Native, Indian, and white conflict from minor skirmishes to major battles as the cultures clashed. Yet the continuing conflicts of historic enemies such as Blackfoot Cree and Blackfoot Assiniboine, leading to horse capture raids, captive women, skirmishes, battles, and even that glamorous word massacres happened on occasion. In fact, it happened in 1870, two big battles between the Blackfoot and a combined Assiniboine Cree force in the Canadian Northwest Territory. A few notes are in order as the tales of WhoopUp Country flow. Many of the stories and words come directly from the colorful pioneers and participants in that saga. I've presented unfiltered stories of the WhoopUp Trail, the trading posts, the colorful characters, and the frontier times. These are real pioneers speaking in the words of their times, terms that may bother or offend today's reader. Let's not rewrite or erase history, but rather learn from it. Let's understand their environment of culture clash and learn from their often tense, sometimes desperate times. The riches to be made in the absence of law and order drew a wide mix of humanity, saints and sinners, leading to incidents and conflicts culminating in a battle in the Cypress Hills between Fort Benton Wolfers and North Assiniboine Nakota, the so-called Cypress Hills Massacre. Let me read just a bit about this important Cypress Hills incident and its aftermath. What began as a skirmish ended as a battle and was declared by Canadian authorities a massacre. In April 1873, a mixed party of 8 American and Canadian traders returning from their winter trade in the Northwest Territory camped near Fort Benton. The next morning, victim of a nighttime raid, they discovered their horses stolen by unknown natives. At Fort Benton, the traders sought military assistance from Lieutenant James Bradley and his 7th Infantry Company stationed at Fort Benton, part of the regiment from Fort Shaw under Civil War General John Gibbon. Denied military aid, the Wolfers, led by Johnny Evans and Tom Hardwick, departed on a mission to track down and retrieve their stolen horses. Crossing the border into the Cypress Hills, the party tracked the horses to the vicinity of the trading posts of 2 Fort Benton traders, Abe Farwell and Mose Solomon, in the Cypress Hills, with the nearby camp of Nakota. Over the next few hours, a wild and confusing series of events transpired, leaving from 20 to 40 natives and 1 French Canadian, Ed Lagrace, dead. The legend of the Cypress Hills Massacre was born, triggering action by the Canadian government at last to face their law and order situation, or lack of law and order, in the Northwest Territory. Responding to complaints from both sides of the border, the Canadian government in 1873, after the massacre, belatedly formed the Northwest Mounted Police, today's Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and sent them west in the summer of 1874 to establish law and order, to close down the Montana traders and the whiskey trade, and coerce the free traders across the border back into Montana. The result was lively and surprising. You'll read about the saga of the Great March West as the newly formed Northwest Mounted Police marched overland westward over unmarked and rugged terrain. And there was a reason why there were no roads that would follow until the railroad came in 1883. It was rough country. And the Northwest Mounted Police had brought the wrong horses. They brought show horses, and yet they were trying to pull many cannon and other heavy wagons. So about a third of their horses died along the way. About a third of their troops deserted during the march. And of course, for the Canadians, it's called the Great March West, a very glorious arrival in Western Canada. So the arrival, their first priority, and actually I've neglected to mention that they were lost. Their guides were from further east in Canada. They didn't know the territory, and so they were lost until they sent they found a group of Fort Benton guys, and they learned where the roads were, where the trail was that would later become, well, was the WhoopUp Trail, and also where Fort WhoopUp was, and so on. So their first priority was to shut down, conquer Fort WhoopUp, and they were expecting something in the neighborhood of 200 or 300 desperate defenders at Fort WhoopUp. And yet, when they arrived, and this is one of the sketches that they brought two very good artists along the Great March West. Fortunately, wish Lewis and Clark had been smart enough to take artists with them, but they weren't. So arriving at Fort WhoopUp, the mounted police expected this heavily armed resistance and a fierce fight before they seized the fort's liquor supply. But instead of that, they found the gate open, just 6 men, one of them, in fact, the man that greeted them was a legless cripple, Charles Shaft, who invited the police to join them for a fine dinner. Of course, the booze had been well hidden in advance. While their arrival and actions through the winter of 1874-75 made significant progress in most of their objectives, the problem of Cypress Hills remained. As they gathered intelligence and identified participants, they discovered that most of those involved were no longer in the territory. So they formed a plan and asked the U.S. government to hold an extradition hearing. And so in Helena here, the extradition trial in the spring of 1875 was held for 5 of the accused. And it was a fascinating episode. They could only get one man who would testify against the culprits, and so Commissioner Cullen wound up declaring that there was insufficient evidence to return the prisoners to Canada to go on trial, and he freed them. So about a dozen of these, they charged 5 in the trial, but there were about 7 others involved around, and so they were cheered here in Fort Benton. They went on back to Fort Benton, and John J. Donnelly was the perfect man. He hated the British because he was Irish, and he'd been a general in the Irish Fenian invasions of Canada a couple of the times after after the Civil War, and Donnelly had actually been a high-ranking Irish brigade officer as well. So that failed, as well as the Canadians, the Northwest Mounted Police, had been able to find 3 of the participants in the Cypress Hills incident in Canada, so they put them on trial in Winnipeg. Well, they were freed because of the judgment in Helena against the others, and the Canadian court threw that out as well. The extradition trial ended, and the big celebrations took place in Fort Benton. The clerk for the Canadian Mounted Police, the Northwest Mounted Police, was actually James T. Stanford, who later went on to marry a Conrad and become a very upstanding Montanan, especially up around Kalispell. Here he was a brigadier general with the National Guard, Montana National Guard, around the time of in the 1890s. So the prisoners were charged and they were released, and Johnny Evans, who was one of the leaders of the Wolfers and the ones that had been tried here, went back to Fort Benton, bought a saloon, and opened it with the name Extradition Saloon. So they had a huge celebration in Fort Benton and a triumphant return there. Over the decades that followed, memories of the wild and woolly WhoopUp era flowed forth in pioneer reminiscences and historical articles on both sides of the border. The nasty, low-life whiskey traders emerged in reality as exceptional frontiersmen like Howell Harris, Charles E. Conrad, Donald W. Davis, you name them, really, leading players in the settlement of the Canadian West. For every scoundrel, there were dozens of men of talent and ability. There was one scoundrel, Tom Hardwick, but he was vastly outnumbered, including 7 later sheriffs of Choteau County, not to say that they were angels either, but yet over time, stories of the WhoopUp Trail and the era faded from the public mind. Memories of the trail, this great international avenue of trade with its shared lifeline and culture, had the 1935 Lethbridge Herald. Small towns along the trail raised awareness on occasion by promoting stories or events, and Conrad High School even exchanged letters with Charlie Russell about the WhoopUp Trail and brought out its high school yearbook, naming it WhoopUp Trail, and it's still named WhoopUp Trail. And for the past 80 years, the town of Conrad has held an annual WhoopUp Trail Days celebration. Both Lethbridge and Fort Benton have held joint celebrations for dedication of trail markers or WhoopUp historical pageants. While the memories have faded, the shared bonds remain to this day. In August 17 years ago, I joined 14 other members of the Fort Benton River and Plains Society to travel north, not along a WhoopUp Trail, but along modern highways across a now well-defined and marked medicine line to the Lethbridge area to visit and tour Fort WhoopUp, the reconstructed fort. The Fort Benton group, symbolically representing free traders and led by Executive Director John G. Lepley, was hosted at a breakfast and given a special tour by Fort WhoopUp's director, Doran Dagenstein, and historian Gord Tolton. More events followed at Fort Macleod, including the dedication of a new Royal Canadian Mounted Police barracks and the famed Mounted Police musical ride. I took this photo on that trip with Jack and Bob Dirk admiring the Fort Benton cannon taken by Johnny Healy to Fort WhoopUp in 1870, and we haven't figured a way out to get it back to Fort Benton. Last year, on the 150th anniversary, our Overholser Historical Research Center presented a display tribute to WhoopUp Country at the entrance to the Montana State Agricultural Museum, and Fort Benton planned to celebrate WhoopUp at 150 years during the annual summer celebration. But then COVID struck, canceling summer celebration events and even closing the medicine line, so we didn't have Canadian visitors joining us. We're still waiting for that heavy two-way flow of traffic across the medicine line, bringing about a third of the visitors and trade from Canada to towns like Fort Benton and Great Falls, for that matter, located in WhoopUp Country. This year, Fort Benton is celebrating its 175th anniversary, and we had summer celebrations this year. yet again without Canadian visitors. 6 weeks ago, on August 24th, we were once more reminded of our shared history, this on the occasion of the visit of more than 24 leaders from the Blackfoot Confederacy. It's important to note the three tribes, 3 of the 4 Blackfoot nations reside north of the Medicine Line in Alberta, yet they came on this 175th anniversary to Fort Benton to pay tribute to the town they call Many Homes to the South. Among the many tributes, Kainai Chief Roy Fox and others spoke eloquently with stories about our shared past, and that included a woman whose ancestor had been a tailor at the fort, and many who had actually not traditional Blackfoot names, but names like Weatherwax and Evans and so on, because of the intermarriage between the Fort Benton traders and the Blackfoot. So here's to the colorful Johnny Healy who started the whole thing, to our shared history with our Indigenous neighbors and the Canadian prairie provinces, and to WhoopUp Country as we hoop it up at 151 years. Thank you. Now, I know at least one here has an ancestor who was a bullwhacker on Fort WhoopUp. She showed me briefly before the meeting, a really interesting story, and that's fun to see how much tie with the present there still is. Most of Montana doesn't know about WhoopUp Country, doesn't understand it, so I hope if you didn't know when you came, you now have a feel for why that came. And I'll be glad to answer a few questions, and then I'll move on out and be glad to talk further and sign some books. I think they want us all out of here by 6 o'clock, so we've got time for questions if you have any. Yes?
Is there any way to estimate the amount of liquor or whiskey that went up the trail as a percentage of the total trade and other stuff?
The question is about how much liquor was involved in the trade. I think that was briefly what the question's about. You know, I spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about that because especially Canadian historians write as if it was the WhoopUp experience that introduced alcohol to the natives, when in fact, for maybe hundreds, but at least 100 or more years, the Hudson Bay Company had been trading rum and other liquor. The American Fur Company certainly was trading various types of booze, and it had gotten to the point by this late 1860s, early 1870s, that many of the natives would not trade without alcohol being part of the whole festivities and the whole transaction. I don't think there's any real measurement about how much, say if you took 100% of the trade, was 10% of it alcohol? I don't know. I've never seen anybody even try to estimate that. But I do know that most of the goods that went up the WhoopUp Trail were legitimate trading goods. And then there was the kind of covertly freighted, like Joe Kipp had taken 50 gallons, was what he had bought here in Helena and was taking up to fuel his trading posts. A few of the trading posts would not trade in whiskey, but they had trouble attracting natives to trade. It was sad. And James Willard Schultz wrote, and I don't have the quote with me, but he wrote an amazing short statement after the WhoopUp period, saying that it wasn't the WhoopUp period that was the serious problem, although it did tend to get out of hand with 40 traders competing, and it started with Healy, Hamilton, legitimate trading post, but there certainly were instances where alcohol was being dispensed. But what Kip said was that the period that was hardest and most tragic, and he was talking primarily, I think, about the Blackfoot, but I think you could probably apply it to the Nakota and the other tribes, was that during the reservation period and during the starvation winters, I mean, after WhoopUp, when the reservation regimen was being enforced, there were years and years where it was far worse than during the WhoopUp period. So yes, there was alcohol and so on. Ironically, one of the traders who apparently didn't trade at his post in whiskey was J.D. Weatherwax, and yet through circumstances, circumstance being another trader had asked him to take over his post temporarily, and unfortunately Weatherwax agreed to do that, and the other post had whiskey, and the mounted police had arrived by that time and found whiskey, and so they arrested J.D. Weatherwax and held him for 6 months in prison at Fort Macleod. Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much then. And I'll move out to a table out front there, and I'll be glad to talk, or if you want a copy of the book, you can get it from Rod and come, I'll sign it.